Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts Podcast.
Hello.
Today, we are going to be talking about purity culture.
Yay. I feel like we need some sound effect buttons,
We,
like
I
either like
know.
wah, wah, or,
Yeah,
cheering.
I know. I feel like we need something because,
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of like purity culture. It's like, and I don't know why I said that so excitedly
I
because
know.
it's heavy, but also it's like I know it's so relevant and like I am excited about
Yes.
having these conversations. Um,
Yes, I agree. Yeah, it is. It's like relieving almost. It's like, oh, yeah, but also, ugh.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
a good word for it. That's a good word for
Mhm.
it. And so, of
Mhm.
course, we've already had one of these conversations. And Laura, I'll ask
Mhm.
you, like, yeah, what have you enjoyed or appreciated about just the conversations that
Yeah.
we've had so far?
Yeah, of course I always appreciate hearing other people's perspectives because we all have such different experiences, and yet the more I hear from other people, the more I recognize they're also very, very similar perspectives and experiences and outcomes of those experiences. So I just appreciated being able to not only hear your experience and, hear about some of the work you're doing with clients, but I think that purity culture in particular can bring up so much shame in us. It's shame in an isolating way where we're like, oh, I must have been the only one who experienced this. And so I think to have these conversations, I really appreciate them because we start to realize like I'm not the only one. And whether that's I'm not the only one who went through this, or I'm not the only one who's still dealing with the impacts of this. And that feels particularly important. And just being able to understand even some of the specifics that we're going to be talking about today, whether they're psychological or physiological outcomes or impacts, I think that's extremely important. And I really enjoyed having that conversation and being able to share from my own perspective and hear yours. But what did you enjoy from this conversation?
Yeah, I just appreciate being able to just normalize having open conversations about this, really, and then the fact that we
Yeah.
have just yeah, I just and having this being on this being an ongoing topic of conversation. I just because it's like just like in the church, just like when we from our background where it's something you don't really talk about, or at least
Mhm.
if you do, it's laden with shame and which does lead to isolation, like you said, where you did you then you're now maybe you are deconstructing, maybe you have deconverted, maybe you're out of a church, but it's still something
Mhm.
that you don't really talk about. Like you maybe kind of bring it up in therapy, but like
Mhm.
maybe not totally, maybe kind of you come at it indirectly. So just talking about it openly, just I think is
Mhm.
just I think that can be so cathartic and liberating for people to even just
Mm.
realize you're not alone, first of all, and we can talk about these things. We can talk about them openly and directly. And I think that is just I just think that's an incredibly powerful
Mhm.
part of just healing, being able to have that community and have those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I'm really excited for us to get into it. And so before we do, I just wanted to offer a quick disclaimer because we do recognize that some of the topics that we discuss in this episode or any episode can bring up different feelings, emotions, and triggers that might require more processing or might be too much to handle in the right here and right now. So like we've said before, please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back if and when you're ready. Our goal in doing this podcast and talking about these issues is to help you learn how to trust your own body and your own lived experience. So, to that end, you can take what you need and leave what you don't. All right, everybody, it is time for our vocabulary lesson. And today I wanted to talk about a bit of like a pop culture term that we hear on social media a lot, and that is an inner child. I want to just kind of have this discussion on like if we have an inner child, what is it? Is there like actually an inner child living inside of us? Yeah, I know I've seen a lot of kind of memes and stuff like that on the internet. So I thought it would be a good conversation to have a little bit more kind of an in-depth discussion about. So I think the best place to start would be what is an inner child? And Andrew, I'm curious to know your thoughts.
Yeah. So, what is an inner child? I mean, first of all, I just usually tell folks like, it's just a construct. It's a way of understanding
Mhm.
ourselves. And the inner child is really just talking about those parts of ourselves that are like intrinsic to our identity that have been there like our entire lives. You're right about it. Like showing up in memes a lot. A lot of people use the term, and not
Mhm.
everybody means the same thing when they say that term. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't put too much weight in terms of it. Like is it real or is it not real? Like it's just a framework. It's a way to understand a part of ourselves and a way of being able to approach that and work on that, like in the context of therapy or coaching.
Mm. Wait, so there's not actually like a small child living inside me?
There is not literally a small child living inside of you.
Okay. That makes so much more sense. Yeah. Yeah, I would very much agree with it. I kind of use the term pop psychology not to necessarily take away from like the validity of what's being talked about there, but I think when
Mhm.
we talk about in terms of research, what we might call empirical evidence, so that's the stuff that people are researching, and there's
Mhm.
kind of some information behind that. I don't think there's really much around the concept of an inner child. And yet, I also don't believe that we have to have research for everything in order to validate it, because I do think that the language and concept of the inner child can be extremely helpful for people.
Mhm.
I know for me personally, it's been quite useful. I know for many of my clients, it's been really useful. It's been a really helpful way of understanding kind of how I'm interacting with myself and the world and relationships and the parts of me that are wounded. So that part right there, we both use the word part or parts. I wonder if you can speak to how the inner child and parts work coming from internal family system might work together, or are they two separate things?
Mhm. Yeah, no, it definitely fits perfectly with IFS, in my opinion. So, like in parts work, of course, you have parts and there's protectors and exiles, and you could look at those as being inner children if that framework makes sense to you. Like
Mm-hmm.
protector parts could
Mm-hmm.
be seen as like parentified inner children. Exiled parts could be viewed as inner children that are the most wounded, the most isolated, traumatized, whatever, again, whatever word works for you and makes sense in that regard. But yes, it does fit nicely with internal family systems, I think, because
Mm-hmm.
that is really a lot of what IFS does is in alignment with at least a lot of what I've heard when people talk about inner child work. Granted, different
Mm-hmm.
people sometimes mean different things, but oftentimes it does sound pretty consistent with IFS and the way that we are learning to look
Yeah.
inward, approach our parts with curiosity and compassion, helping them to like unburden or helping to reparent them. That's another term I hear people use in this context, reparenting yourself.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think for myself personally and how I work with clients when we use the language of inner parts, or sorry, inner child,
Mhm.
I do really pay attention to what resonates for the client. So there's some clients that will use like inner child or inner adolescent, or inner 5-year old or inner 7, like if they use that language, that's what I go with as their
Mhm.
practitioner. If they use the language of parts, I go with that, kind of whatever fits for the client. I think one of the unique things that I've found in terms of working with the concept of inner child is I actually mix that a lot with attachment theory,
Mhm.
developmental psychology, and somatic therapies. Meaning that if I have an inner child, 3-year-old inner child, if I'm working with a client who has that, uh, the work that we do is not going to be to just tell that kid something. You're safe, right? If we think of developmental psychology and we think of an actual 3-year-old who is sitting next to us, who is feeling scared, we would probably engage in some very physical forms of connection that would help that child feel safe. It would be one thing for them to hear that they're safe, but to feel safe, have that embodied experience, that's a whole other way of then existing in the world. And so oftentimes I'll take the inner child, kind of whatever age they're resonating with, and I'll look at it through the lens of developmental psychology. And I'll say, okay, what would an actual 7-year-old need to feel loved, connected, safe, attached, able to be creative and curious in the world? And that's typically then an indicator of what that person is needing and what we need to figure out how to kind of install some internal resources to feel that the same way our actual child should have been able to feel that, when we were that age. So I know that's one of the ways that I work with the inner child. And I'm curious to know, because I want to come back to one of the statements that you said eventually, like kind of how the inner child term has taken on a life of its own. But before that, like I'm just curious to know how it is that you would work with an inner, client who really resonates with the idea of the inner child, and if that's important to them to bring into therapy or coaching.
Yeah. Well, so honestly, a lot of what you said is a lot of what ends up happening. I feel like with the folks that I work with, I do actually use a lot of attachment theory stuff, that focus, as well as somatic based things. And everything that you said too, like kind of, this is paraphrasing a bit, but like basically showing up for, like, say it's a 5-year-old inner child, like that's like kind of the age that resonates, showing up for that child the way that they weren't shown up for, you weren't shown up for, like in that developmental time in your life. And that can actually end up being kind of like that reparenting process that I mentioned a little while ago. I think that is a pretty important part of IFS when it comes to working with some of those exiled parts of ours. But I feel like I'm starting to go off on a tangent. What was the original question though?
Yeah, just kind of how you would work with a client who is interested in inner child work.
Yeah, definitely. If they're interested in it, both the body base, the somatic piece is important, but yeah, honestly, attachment, that lens has been extremely helpful. I've noticed that's been extremely helpful. And like you said, it's like rooted in developmental psychology. Like, there is a lot of evidence behind it. And yeah, kind of exploring through that lens of like, how do you show up in like relationships, and not even like intimate relationships, but like just family, friends, just with interacting with other humans.
Yeah.
And you do feel insecure. What do you do? What happens? And then notice, what do you notice? Like, how does that feel? Like, where do you notice it? What's happening? Can you notice it? Or sometimes actually what's very frequently happening, especially for those of us who've come out of like high control religion, is I don't feel anything. I'm all up in my head. And so that's actually a pretty common place to start.
Yeah.
But again, it's really just bringing our awareness and our curiosity to both the physical experience, but then also initially recognizing patterns of how do we show up? What do we do when we don't feel safe in a particular social connection, social relationship? Because then that really starts to explain, well, what your attachment style is, which to me, that just tells me how your parts learned to stay safe when they weren't being supported at that time in your life. And so anyway, that's kind of a foundational piece. I mean, I could talk for days about parts work and all of the stuff, I'm sure, but that is definitely kind of a foundational piece, all of that together.
Yeah, I think you bring up something so interesting there, talking about the religious trauma piece, and both of us have used the word reparenting. And I think one of the things, to your point, so many of us who grew up in high control religions had to silence or squash or kind of fragment or morph parts of ourselves in order to truly survive, right? And not maybe not even survive in like a real rational, logical sense, but the experience of like kind of feeling in a bit of survival mode. Like if I don't do this thing, I might go to hell. I'll be disconnected from my family. I'll be punished. God won't love me anymore. And so I think, so I think about all the ways then that we had to fragment who we were in order to show up in a very specific way, so that we could be safe. And so then when we look at the work of the inner child, it's being able to bring those parts of us back online and kind of integrate them into who we are in the present. But then there's that reparenting piece. And the two things that popped up from you and where when you were talking about that is reparenting, meaning that I have to acknowledge that there was things as a child that I needed and I did not get. Whether that is safety, security, connection, playfulness, creativity, ways to express myself, autonomy, learning practical things, right? And so then we have to acknowledge that that's the case. And even though we cannot literally go back and do those things, part of the work then of reparenting is viewing ourselves in the present day as the loving parent who is bigger and stronger and wiser and more compassionate and more nurturing and able to provide that to ourselves. And so that sometimes means really practical things like we need to go teach ourselves how to play. Like we need to go find some fun activities and engage in them. And other times it means that we need to, in moments of fear, we need to be able to, pretend as if that little child's on my lap and squeezing them tight and rocking back and forth and letting them know it's going to be okay, because that's what we needed back then and we didn't get it. So it's us becoming the parent to our child selves in the ways that we were not able to have a parent back then. And that's certainly not to say I'm not trying to vilify parents. I think every parent is doing the best that they can, but this is a reality that many of us are living with, and especially coming out of high control religions where there was certain fundamental, like developmentally fundamental things that were considered unnecessary for many children because all these other spiritual things were considered more necessary or to take precedence over. So yeah, I'm curious to know too, from your perspective, that reparenting piece, what would you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think sometimes it can be really playful and just like stuff that you wouldn't think is like, I mean, I'll give you a specific example. Like there was one, someone I worked with, like one of the things that they did for themselves, like that young was literally go and buy an overpriced Star Wars action figure.
I love that
because it was one they always wanted and were never able to have for various reasons. And just, and it sounds to someone who doesn't maybe like Star Wars action figures at any rate, it might sound trivial, but yeah, it's like, I don't know. I think there's something very cathartic about that, even though, I'm not playing with these the way that I did maybe when I was 9 years old, but also I think there's a lot of meaning behind that. And I think I really don't think we can overstate how powerful ritual and ceremony are for human beings, just in creating meaning. And I don't even mean in a spiritual or overtly religious sense, but I do think there's something very powerful in that. So even the act of you as that compassionate parent now recognizing how this little kid yourself didn't get something, really wanted something, deserved good things, but was let down. And then doing that, like literally actually doing at least the parts that are within your control. Because like you said, we can't literally go back in time. And that's not the point. That's not what we're trying to do. But sometimes there are tangible things you can do like that are kind of cool. And when you do see those opportunities arise, it's kind of fun to see that happen. It's kind of fun to also get to play with like just the creativity and the playfulness of it, of when you, and this is not usually the first step you do, I granted, but it is a fun place to get to when you have done some work and there is starting to be a certain level of like of feeling safe, that felt sense of safety like you've referred to. And then you are able to start leaning in more into the creativity and the playful side of things of like, okay, so what would you like to do? Like what's something fun that you would like to do? If you could do anything, what would it be? Like, and just start playing around with that and seeing where it goes. It was literally conversations like that brought up the Star Wars action figure piece.
Yes.
So, and who knows? You never know where it will lead. It might surprise you, but it's oftentimes a lot of fun to see that.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's really cool. You mentioned earlier that sometimes the term inner child kind of takes on a life of itself in maybe social media or kind of public spaces. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yes. So anybody who has spent any amount of time on Instagram or TikTok has probably already seen this term all over the place.
Right.
Um, yeah, and so it's taken on a life of its own. In that, I mean, there's lots of folks out there, everybody from coaches to therapists to all sorts of other titles, that are talking about inner child work, and they don't always mean the same thing. That different folks mean different things when they say that.
Mhm.
So, and it's not to say that they're all wrong or bad or harmful. Like, I'm not saying that they are, but just being aware that it is one of those phrases that has very much become popular, especially in the past
Mhm.
5 years, maybe 5 to 10 years. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It is commonly used, and it's not one of those phrases. Well, like you said earlier, it's not really like this evidence-based protocol type of
Mhm.
modality. There's not a thing that is inner child work.
Mhm.
That is, it can mean a lot of different things in the therapy world,
Mhm.
evidence-based clinical counseling and psychology and all of that. The closest thing that comes to it would be internal family systems.
Right.
And it does work with a lot of that. So, but yeah, there's going to be lots of folks out there, some therapists included, that, yeah, maybe talking about inner child work. But really, all I would say is, it's not to say that I would avoid people who are doing that. I would just
Mhm.
understand that they may mean something different, and then just ask questions so that you can understand, what do you mean when you say inner child work? What does that look like? How does that work in your practice when, in terms of like working with coaches or therapists who say they do it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important kind of thing to be aware of with a lot of social media, and
Mm,
probably what people have been able to gather from some of our vocabulary lessons is that, there are a lot of terms and words and
mm,
phrases that are thrown around in a conversational or colloquial sense that are used one way that may not be like accurate or clinically accurate or are partially accurate, and that can be okay, but in other cases that actually can be really like disorganizing and can
yeah.
kind of keep us from moving forward in our own work. And so I think it's good to have that recognition of like, it is okay to ask a therapist, a coach, whomever, if they're saying, I do inner child work with people, ask them what that means to them and then see if
Hmm.
that resonates with you.
Hmm.
Ask them if they do internal family systems as well. And would it be okay to do that, but use the language of an inner child? I think that can be really important. I agree
Hmm.
with that. So as we wrap this up, I can think of a resource that I have really come to appreciate over the last several years. And I'm curious to know from you too. When I think about inner child work or parts work, one of the books that I really like is called Homecoming by John Bradshaw. It's a pretty old book. It was actually written, like, I think in the early 80s. I believe he has since passed away. I will kind of a little caveat, there's pretty like gender stereotypes and, he, she language. It's
Hmm.
not necessarily inclusive language. However, the exercises that he is talking about have the ability to be extremely inclusive and be able to be tailored to what your own individualized experience is. But what I really appreciate about his work is that he does recognize this concept of the inner child. He combines it very well with developmental psychology and the various needs that we have at those different developmental stages, as well as what we can likely expect if those needs were not met. And so
Hmm.
how we might see that coming out in our adult lives. And then he gives tons of exercises for every single developmental stage. How do we connect with our inner child at that age?
Hmm.
And so you think about like if I have like an inner infant, well, we need basic needs then, right? We need to make sure that our
Hmm.
basic needs are being met. Everything from food, water, and shelter to basic security, sense of safety, stability.
Hmm.
When we think about a 3-year-old, we need play, right? And so I really love how he takes people through to say, kind of look around, reflect on your life as it is as an adult and notice where are some of the gaps, and that might indicate what age an inner child or inner children are that may need that extra support and recovery and reparenting. So it's called Homecoming by John Bradshaw. That's a resource I would recommend. And not to put you on the spot, because I don't even know if we talked about this, but do you have any resources that you recommend, Andrew?
Yeah, no, I do. And I may have shared this one in other times at different various episodes, but No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz.
Yes.
I mean, if we're anything that's related to parts work or possibly related to parts work, like inner child stuff, yeah, I very much always recommend this book. There are other good resources too. I do like this one because it's affordable. It's not a textbook. It's not a clinical manual. So it's meant to be accessible by anybody. You do not have to have any background in anything other than just you're curious about how it can help heal trauma and restore wholeness, and like that, as it says like in the subtitle. That's so yeah, and he definitely includes exercises, one or two exercises I believe at the end of each chapter. But yeah, it's affordable, it's very accessible, it's very readable, and I think it's under 200 pages. So
yeah, there's a great audio version of that book too, where Dick Schwartz, who's the author of the book, leads you through the exercises. And it's just, he has a presence and a voice about him that I really connect with. And I really like hearing him read those. So it feels extra special that he's kind of guiding you through the various activities. So highly recommend. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, my inner child's needing a drink of water right now. Just kidding. I think that's a good place to end.
It sounds like it is. All right, everyone. Today we are going to be doing a bit of a deep dive on a topic that I know comes up a lot within the deconstruction community, but also just the community of all folks who have either left or are healing from high control religion. And that is the subject of purity culture. So we are going to be, oh yeah, yay. So much excitement, but seriously, it's heavy, but it's like, I'm excited to talk about it. It's a thing that is so needed conversations around this. I think it's a thing that as we can really start to dive into it and unpack it, I think it's really needed. I think it'll resonate with a lot of folks.
Yeah, I think just really like as that overview, I would say that I don't have any clients that I'm currently working with or have worked with in the past that have not brought up some element of purity culture into their sessions. I mean, it's so far reaching, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual identity. Every single client has brought some element of purity culture into our work together. So it's prevalent. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I agree. It's a thing that I think it's a lens through which we are conditioned to see just not only human sexuality. I mean, I think a lot of times that is one of the more obvious examples, but sexuality, but gender norms, and then even just society as a whole. Because I mean, honestly, it even extends beyond just Christian fundamentalism to the culture, especially Western culture, to the culture as a whole. And so I think it's a thing that as it starts to really unpack and we start to really look at it, like, oh yeah, it's everywhere, and it does impact everyone, and it's one of those things where it's like you almost don't. It's like you almost took it for granted because it was so just everywhere. You know?
Yeah, I agree. I think when people. When they think of purity culture, I think one of the first things that comes to mind is like in the early 90s, I think it was 1994, is when the True Love Waits campaign kind of started to sweep the nation, and everybody was signing their pledge cards and, pledging their virginity to their future spouse and your future spouse only. Of course, it was targeted at, middle school, high schoolers, and college kids. I know I'm a few years older than you, so I don't know how old you were during that time, but I was in the later parts of middle school and high school when this was like up and coming. And so I definitely signed the pledge cards. And I, went up in front of my church and was part of the group that was like pledging abstinence until marriage. And I got a purity ring, a few years later from my parents. And I was all in, despite the fact that I was kind of a late bloomer when it came to like puberty. So I was like, I don't really even know what I'm doing here, but like apparently this is what I'm supposed to do because not only is everybody else doing it, but I guess this is what God wants, right? So, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was definitely, I think, in middle school, and that was really going on, a lot of it. I will say, growing up Adventist, I certainly knew about
Mhm.
like the I Kiss Dating Goodbye and stuff like that, but
Right.
we didn't get into that directly, at least not the actual book, because it's a non-Adventist author. So so some of the more progressive Adventists might have. That's so ironic that I would say the more progressive ones would be the ones who actually got the book, but no, it's
Yeah.
like, but the message of it though was definitely something that I think was taken to heart. And oh yeah, and of course we also didn't do the rings because it's jewelry, and Adventists don't.
Right.
Tradition
Yeah.
conservative Adventists don't do jewelry, but no,
Yes.
the idea of like courtship rather than just
Yes.
frivolous dating. That idea that was very much encouraged. Very much was pushed to um, you're waiting until you save yourself until marriage before you have sex, but not even that. I mean, I don't know that it was like officially pushed, but it was definitely celebrated when somebody even would say, "Oh yeah, we didn't even kiss until on our wedding day," or something like that.
I mean,
Um,
that was my promise. Like I had my first kiss very, very well into my adult years. Like, maybe just a couple months shy of my 30th birthday because I was waiting until I got married to kiss
yeah.
anybody. Well, my future husband. And I was only going to kiss him because I really believed that to do it otherwise would mean I was cheating on my future husband.
You were not only cheating on your future spouse, but also it's that slippery slope of temptation. It's like, oh, well,
Right.
one day it's hand holding, then it's kissing, and then you're,
And you're in bed
pregnant.
and naked
Then,
together.
yeah, it's like everything.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it is amazing the amount of weight that
Yeah.
places on a middle school child, because that's, I think, and
Mhm.
honestly, some of us might have even had it put on us in elementary school, I suppose. But I
Oh,
know
for
middle,
sure.
like fifth, sixth, and seventh grade, I'm thinking for a lot is for a lot of us, I think, is when it really started to be pushed. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's like, what
Yeah.
a weight to put on a kid.
Hmm. Yeah. And one thing before we get too much further into it, I think it's worth noting. I really love the work of Sarah Mosliner and some other people as well, Diana Anderson. I know Linda K. Klein's book talks about this as well. I think it's important to note that, like, purity culture as we know it today, so what started with the True Love Waits campaign,
Mm-hmm.
the research would suggest it actually started many decades before that. Sarah Mosliner, who really is a scholar and kind of one of the pioneers in like purity culture research, she did her entire PhD dissertation on it. Like she really goes back to like in her dissertation goes back to like the 40s, like the post World War II era, where
Mm-hmm.
people were like prior to that, you think about like sex education, it was primarily a community health issue. Like they wanted to have safer sex tools and contraception so that there was like a decrease in medical issues and
Mm-hmm.
increase in hygiene and things like that. And so prior to the end of World War II, that's primarily what sexual education was about. Of course, there was other cultural norms and things around like pregnancy and before marriage, things like that, but that was one of the main things that they pushed, really, was like the hygiene pieces of it. Post World War II, though, is when we started to get into what eventually led to, kind of 1994 and, nailing the purity cards on the national or the Capitol lawn or what the National Mall or whatever. But it was really a result of, there's a lot of racism roots in there, in terms of like purity of race and
Mm-hmm.
wanting to protect the white woman and wanting to make
Yeah.
sure that, that there was a pure race that was being pushed forward. There's a lot of cultural stereotypes around interracial relationships, especially around Black men and
Mm-hmm.
Black women as well, in terms of like what their sexuality, like how it was performed and who they were as individuals and what they were capable of. And so as I've looked at the research, like I see these themes in there that eventually created this like really pretty package of like no sex before marriage, but it was really built on this, and it was built on a dynamic and a foundation of power and control, of saying we are going to
Mm-hmm.
put very tight prescriptions around who you can be with, what that relationship can look like, what are the roles of the two people and only two people that are in that relationship, what is the right kind of relationship. So a cisgender, heterosexual, lifelong legal marriage, right? And so what do you have to do in order to like have that? And then how are you supposed to live out in that way? Then you have kids, and the husband does this and the wife does this, and then you're going to get this result. And so I think it's worth noting that underneath and or decades before we had the True Love Waits campaign, there was all this other momentum underneath it, building up to this point. And so it looks really pretty on the outside. And there's many people that do not understand what got us to that point, but we have to understand the roots of it in order to understand why this was pushed so hard in the early to mid 90s, all the way up through today.
Yeah. Wow. That's an incredibly good point. And it's funny how I didn't make as strong of a connection. And yet at the same time, I'm actually pretty familiar with a lot of some of the past you were alluding to, like, especially with like the racial component too. And like there's a lot of like overlap then with like the eugenics movement.
Absolutely.
And all of that. Yep. And then and really how the eugenics movement evolved after World War II, and especially after the Holocaust, because that's of course then suddenly it wasn't quite as socially acceptable to be as overtly racist as one once was, perhaps.
Absolutely.
But it still found ways to continue. And I know just even in my home state here, North Carolina, is actually one of the more notorious states for eugenics programs to continue post-war, even into the 60s and maybe even the 70s. And specifically what that looked like was forced sterilization of lots of women, most of them women of color, most of them Black women, but indigenous as well. And yeah, I mean, it was absolutely a race purifying thing rooted in power dynamics and white supremacy, honestly.
Absolutely.
That's heavy.
Yeah. And there's like so many, when you start to look at the history of like fundamentalism and politics and religion as they go together, you start to then see a lot of big names and figures and movements that are all woven in together, that all kind of started right at that post-World War II point. And we can really see then themes of oppression, power and control, racism, like all just so many different things. And so I think that even though our conversation today is going to be focused like probably primarily like 1994 onwards, and kind of what it's like to live through purity culture and some of the long-term impacts of that we're seeing in ourselves and with our clients. I think we can't have that conversation without acknowledging that this is a part of it. And maybe this is another conversation we need to have, but I think that we have to at least acknowledge it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and then the history major in me, I love it. I could go off on that rabbit trail all day because there was a lot of things happening back then, the 40s and 50s, the fear of godless communism and all of this hard shift to like far right politics. Not that it was even that far right back then, but like that was a trajectory set in motion. A lot of things were being set in motion back then.
So if people are wanting to do more research on that, I really highly recommend the book Damaged Goods by Diana E. Anderson. And then Sarah Mosliner's work, her first book is Virgin Nation. I feel like she's writing another book, but I'm not quite sure. But she's often featured on the Straight White American Jesus podcast. And she does a lot of seminars that are like embodiment, race, and purity culture, kind of like those three intersections. So I really recommend her work as well for people that are looking to kind of dig into that a little bit more and kind of beyond what we can be talking about today and kind of our scopes of practice. So, okay. So that said, I know we kind of talked a little bit about our own experiences kind of within purity culture, but I am curious to know from you, Andrew, and I can speak to this at some point too, is like, Are there any kind of either psychological or physiological impacts of purity culture that you experienced? And that might be like within relationships or, your own gender or sexuality, just anything that stands out of going like, this was pretty long lasting for me.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things. Where should I start? I mean, I think one of the things that really pops up that I can think back to most readily is just how the languaging. So, like, when you're growing up, like in the church, and the programming, the languaging, I think that's given to girls growing up in the church is that, well, a lot of like body shaming about, you need to
Mm-hmm.
be modest, you need to all of that. Like the burden is on you to
Mm-hmm.
control, to not be a stumbling block for men or boys or whoever. But on the flip side, like, so growing up as a boy in that context as well, it's like there was still definitely a lot of burden placed on you. Well, two things. It was, on the one hand, you're an inherently lustful creature. I mean, they didn't say that explicitly, but that was the message. You are that. And also, yeah, it's like, but then at the same time, it's like, just the way that you're supposed to show up, like just a lot of gender norm stuff, a lot of like stuff that we would readily see and be like toxic masculinity stuff. That sort of stuff was definitely pushed. Yeah, it was. And so there was an undercurrent of shame around
Mm-hmm.
sexuality for men, for
Yeah.
me, or, well, for me. I shouldn't generalize all men because I don't know that all men necessarily feel about it that way, but I suspect they do, because a lot of men are pretty emotionally out of touch when it comes to really being vulnerable about their
Sure.
sexuality in like an emotionally vulnerable context. And so that's, I think, what really happened is that there's this part of you that's like, this is who you naturally are, but at the same time, it's sinful and not good. It's harmful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, you really kind of internalize that. And unfortunately, I think a lot of men internalize it, and then it turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy, because a lot of them do behave very harmfully and very predatory
Yes.
in the way they approach like sexuality, relationships,
Mm-hmm.
just all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but the undercurrent of shame, I think that's the biggest piece that, I mean, and that's a very broad thing to say, I realize, but that's absolutely something that to this day is like things that I still work on in therapy, like just that inherent connection of shame and just inherently intertwined with sexuality, you know?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I've heard that from a lot of my male clients as well. Almost verbatim what you're saying. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't think you're alone in that. And I would suspect that there's a lot of individuals who grew up male or socialized as male
Mm-hmm.
in that in purity culture that share that experience, and it's
Mm-hmm.
devastating.
It's very far reaching. I'll
Mm.
say, I see it a lot too, like with my clients, male clients as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I think for me, you know, I can think similar to you. I can think of many long lasting impacts, but as I was trying to kind of like, what would be some of the most profound or kind of ones that maybe even still impact me to a degree today? One of the things that I thought of is like when I was first starting to become sexually active, we had not been taught about consent at all. And there's
Right,
this
right.
pervasive message of, your body is not your own. It belongs to literally everybody else except for you.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course, no talk about boundaries except for don't have sex until you're married. And if you can, stay as far away from that line because, like you said, slippery slope, right?
Right.
Um, and so I think about when I became sexually active and I started to realize like, okay, my boundaries need to shift. I have a body and I'm still not sure about this whole consent thing. Like, I don't know what's allowed. I don't know any of these things.
Mm-hmm.
I can really see how those three kind of like coalesced into being in many situations where there was a lot of coercion, that I was like worn down until I said yes, or I didn't think that I could say no because we had gone to a certain point, or I don't know, I just didn't think that I could, or I didn't think I could ask for like safer sex options or say things. I really did not have a sense of my own body and autonomy and voice. And so I can see that as a long lasting impact where it really like shaped a lot of my sexual experiences for many, many years because I just had no idea how to interact as a sexual being because I wasn't even supposed to be a sexual person. Like sex is for men. And so,
Mhm.
I just am supposed to fulfill those desires. And even that teaching then is really messy because it means that if I'm interacting with a man, like this isn't about me anyways. So if he wants to
Mhm.
do something, like I don't really have another option other than yes. So I see all of that kind of going together. And then with that, I know a lot of women that I've talked to, and then myself personally, I've experienced a lot of pain, like sexual pain for a variety of different reasons. And I think we'll probably talk about some of that a little bit later. But
Mhm.
I know for me, like I had to come to a point where I was like, wow, I like this is pain. This is what pain feels like. And that's not what I'm supposed to be feeling. And so I need to do something about that. But I didn't even realize that there was an option like that. Oh, it's not supposed to be that way. And I've heard that from a lot of women, especially having a very similar experience and going, oh, well, pain is just part of the process. Like this is
Yeah.
just not, and I'm not talking
Yeah.
about like if that's a kink for you or something, that's not the pain that I'm talking about. I'm talking about pain that you don't want to be there, and various
Mhm.
things. And so I think that's been important. And I think another weird message that's been really kind of lingering is just this. I don't know if it's like because of what you've done, like you don't deserve to be with somebody, like there's a lot of messages, at least I grew up, that if you committed certain sins, that would kind of take you out of the running for a future spouse. And, they wouldn't find you attractive because you had
Yeah.
done X, Y, and Z or hadn't waited for them or whatever. And so I think that there's a lot of pressure that I've put on myself of like, kind of just some of those internalized messages. If I'm not in a relationship that's moving, in a direction that I want it to, I'm like, well, is that part of like, I can't expect to ever have that because I've done these things that, I was
Mhm.
told I wasn't supposed to do. And this is just the natural outcome. So that's another kind of weird, like psychological thing that I still can kind of catch myself in from time to time.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I still remember years ago, it's like, yeah, like when I was younger, still like very much in the church, excuse me, but did not wait until marriage. And then
Yeah.
feeling like
Oh,
and then furthermore, I mean, here's the real curveball. And then you break up and that's not who you end up marrying anyway. Then it's
right.
like
Hmm.
you absolutely feel like that you are damaged goods, basically, that you're like
Hmm.
that you would be like kind of like a consolation prize, like cool, but you're not the ideal anymore. And so because you screwed up and now you just deal with it, I guess. And yeah, and so again, that shame, that layering of shame, that languaging, and just all that implicit shame that exists there. Yeah, it definitely is very, very powerful.
Yeah, it is very long lasting. And I think that kind of leads into maybe the next question that I had was just like, what we're seeing popping up in our office. We shared our experiences, and what I'm hearing is like, shame, lack of bodily autonomy, kind of this feeling of maybe like internalized disgust, like there's something wrong with me. I did this bad thing, and now I'm damaged goods, right? I know I've had a lot of clients. I alluded to this earlier, like experiencing a lot of sexual pain, whether that is vaginismus or other sort of like dis-ease or disorder kind of going on. It can be, which is physiological and psychological connected. I've experienced a lot of, and we'll talk about this later, people that are coming in with very similar symptoms to individuals who have experienced sexual assault, sexualized violence.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people that don't feel like they can't, and then they don't feel like they should experience any sort of pleasure, a lot of numbness, dissociation, kind of feeling isolated, feeling a little bit like I've done this bad thing, but I can't talk to anybody about it. I've also seen a lot of people that were coming out of purity culture, and actually because of the teachings, like they were, experienced a lot of sexualized violence as a result because they didn't understand things like autonomy and consent and boundaries and things like that. Yeah, and just it's just an extreme, of course, lack of sexual education. And so there's
Hmm.
been many times in my office where I'm sitting with a 45-year-old woman going, let's talk about safer sex. Let's talk about birth control. Let's talk about some of these things. So I kind of see the whole gamut of people, coming to me. And so I'm curious what you've noticed in your office, with clients. What are some of the things that pop up in your work with them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I can say that purity culture always comes up, even though
Mhm.
that maybe was not the reason they thought they were coming to see me. It's like
Yes.
it always ends up coming up because it does just permeate everything, I think. Um, yeah, let's see. I think the one thing that I'm definitely seeing a lot of, and I'll speak specifically to folks who were raised male in the church and
Mhm.
or in high control religion. Um, because I do have a lot of male clients, and I can definitely say one theme that I see quite frequently is just this idea that it's okay to like want sex, to want to
Mhm.
experience pleasure, and it doesn't make you like a dirty predatory piece of shit. That's part of like
Yeah.
that's that kind of the other side of that, like that two-edged sword. Because like on the one hand,
Mhm.
we obviously know how extensively harmful purity culture has been, and especially to those raised female and then
Right.
within these institutions and the culture. But that is one other on the flip side. It's like, there's a lot of men I work with who are doing the work, doing therapy,
Mhm.
working through stuff, wanting to do better and be better. And there is also just this inherent shame of that programming of like, yeah, if you're a guy, you're just, you know, like a really high sex drive. You're always horny.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
can't help yourself. Like and then just, and it's just like this gross, icky
Mhm.
vibe that I think a lot of men have kind of internalized around their sexuality. And so it's like then learning to kind of embrace that, come back to it, but in a way that's healthy, that's not causing harm, that is oriented around consent, that is oriented around like equal partnerships, not this dynamic of like the patriarch and the submissive wife bullshit that came out of
Mhm.
a lot of purity culture programming. So yeah, I mean, it's something that it comes up in a variety of ways, but I would say it always comes up eventually with almost everybody that I work with in some capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I know I mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I don't know if you've seen this with your clients, but I have a lot of clients, and this was before I'd even kind of put some of these pieces together because my doctoral research touches on this as well. But I had and still have many clients who were raised in purity culture, other abstinence movements that would come in to my office, and all of their symptomology would be the same as a victim of sexualized violence. So whether that's rape or sexual assault or anything like that. And it was so interesting. And I actually had, I'm a supervisor, I'm a licensure supervisor. So I have other therapists who come to me and we work through cases and things like that. And I
Mm-hmm.
had a therapist who was seeing the same things. And she's like, and I've dug and I've dug and I've dug to see, is there like this repressed sexual trauma and things like that? And she's like, and there isn't. And I believe her. I don't believe that, this person was sexually violated. And yet there's all these symptoms. And so I was able to share with her some of this, purity culture stuff. But interestingly, Dr. Tina Skirmer Sellers, who is, is it the Seattle school? No. She's in Seattle. But she has done some research and has a book called Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, where she really noticed this phenomenon as well. She was having her students, whenever she first started this, these are people that are, growing up in the 90s. So kind of
Mm-hmm.
in the height of some of this purity culture stuff. And she had them do like a sexual history and kind of understanding who they are for this course. And she started noticing the same thing, noticing that there's all of these people that are experiencing an extreme amount of sexual shame and other symptomology that's most closely associated with sexual violence. And it's been shocking to, I mean, shocking, but not shocking, because of course,
Right.
like the way that our bodies are wired, that makes so much sense. And I have an
Yeah.
analogy that I can share, but I first just kind of want to get your input on that to see if that's just kind of what your thoughts are, if that's something you've seen.
Yeah. Oh, yes, it is. Yeah, one thing I have found myself saying to so many folks that I work with, and that is, um, yeah, it's crazy because we were told that you do all the right things, so you wait till marriage. That that is what will lead to a fulfilling and healthy sex life with your
Right.
forever spouse from for the rest of your life. And
Mm-hmm.
then, of course, when then people are, it's like their wedding night, and it's like, stuff's coming up. That's not what I was told was going to come up.
Mm-hmm.
There are like maybe there is shame, maybe there is just things that, like, it's like this is just not working. It's not happening. What's
Mm-hmm.
going, so many, so many stories like that. And yeah, it's one of those things where not really surprising though, because it's like when you've been told, and when your sexuality has basically been shamed and
Mm-hmm.
pathologized literally
Yes.
since you were a child, and certainly since you were an adolescent, it's
Mhm.
like you internalize that, you embody that, and then so when you're assuming you waited, and then when that wedding night does come, it's like, okay, your nervous system can't just flip a switch and be like, oh, hey, I'm not going to associate shame with sexual arousal
Mhm.
anymore. That I've But that's
Absolutely.
what you've been doing for the past 10 years or so, is
Mhm.
associating that with shame and disgust, and no, this is wrong, this is sinful, I can't do this. And so now, yeah, it shows up, and there's that shame again. And yeah, it's
Mhm.
because you can rationally know, no, but I can do this now, right? But your body, your nervous system doesn't know that. It's a different
Right.
part of your brain, it's a different part of your body.
Mhm.
It's not how it works. And
Yeah.
so it's really not surprising, but that's a heavy one, and it's one I do see very,
Mhm.
very frequently.
Yeah. An analogy I often share with my clients is that I believe like sexuality, like the expression of our sexuality, which of course includes, but is not limited to sexual experiences,
Hmm.
but our sexuality is part of who we are from the moment that we're born. And the way it's designed is similar to like a dimmer switch on a light, that where you can like slowly turn it up. And so
Mm.
as a sexual being, that's how we develop sexually, is like we slowly turn that on. And so it's appropriate to our age and where we're at developmentally, so that by the time we're in our teenage years and early 20s and stuff, it's at this place where we've kind of naturally progressed into that, whether that is with ourselves, with a partner or partners, and in a variety of different ways. And that helps kind of ease our nervous system, like you're talking about, into these experiences where it's not feeling, or in most cases, not feeling overwhelming and dangerous, right?
Hmm.
But what's interesting, and I think this is why there is such a correlation between individuals growing up in purity culture and then and then having a first sexual experience, whether that's inside of marriage or not inside of marriage, and sexualized violence victims, is when that happens. So like if you're a child who experiences childhood sexual abuse, it's like the light switch is being flipped on, not like the dimmer switch is gone, the light switch is on, and you're now experiencing things in your body that is not developmentally appropriate if we're talking the case of a child, right? And so that's what leads to these nervous system responses that can result in trauma over time. The same is true with individuals growing up in purity culture. We are told, keep the dimmer switch off. It's off, it's off, it's off, it's off, it's off, right? No natural sexual development. Don't touch yourself. Don't touch other people. This is bad, gross, dirty. So it's off, off,
Hmm.
off, off, off. Then you get to your wedding day. If you did it right, you get to your wedding day and there's two magical words that you say and a piece of paper is signed, and now the light switch is supposed to be flipped on. But because it's never been on before, so many people's bodies experience that as too much, too soon, and too fast. What we notice then is that they do start experiencing physiological symptoms very similar to those who have experienced sexualized violence. And so I think that's a really important thing to notice. And I've noticed it with my clients, and that speaks to what you're talking about with that nervous system response, where our bodies just are not prepared to do that. And I want to be clear that that's not everybody. Like there are some people where for a myriad of different reasons, their bodies don't respond that way, where they are able to get into those sexual experiences without some of those symptoms. And I want to make one other piece on that is there's a lot of people who experience some of those negative symptoms coming out of purity culture and then engaging in sexual experiences, because now not only is the light switch being flipped on, but they're also engaging in this like quote unquote sinful act that they weren't supposed to be until they're married. So we have some compounding factors there. So I think it's sometimes helpful to think of it that way, because it's not, that's where we have to understand like deconstructing those beliefs is so much, that's one thing, but how they live in our bodies is such a different thing. And it can be really helpful to understand that, because that can be a deeply confusing and shameful process.
Yeah. Yeah. I honestly, that is one of the best examples of a cognitive only deconstructing and processing is just that's not enough. Like it is embodied. That's why stuff that does deal with the body and things that are showing up in your body is so incredibly important. I mean, I think it's important across the board, but just this right here, I think is such a good example of that. Because you can rationally know something, you can cognitively understand something, and you're still be having these like nervous system responses to something.
Yeah. So I think that kind of leads us towards like, how do you work with clients that are kind of going through this?
Yes. So lots of, I mean, I always say curiosity and compassion, but depending on where somebody's at too, really just working on establishing safety first and foremost. And everybody starts at a different place in that, obviously. And so it depends as far as like where you start, it depends on the individual person, of course. But yeah, it's a lot of work that is body-based work, being able to kind of experience that sense of safety again, being able to reclaim, well, and maybe not even reclaim, maybe claim for the first time ever, bodily autonomy, and really like getting in touch with and feeling safe within your body. Like that's like those are the things that are like that I definitely focus on and emphasize. And yeah, that does definitely so in the framework of parts work, IFS parts work, which is of course is a lot of what I do, like that definitely does work in that framework. I think I bring in like some attachment lens stuff as well. But yeah, back to the point, or the initial piece was just kind of just really establishing that piece of safety, really. What about you though, in terms of like working with folks?
Yeah, I think what you said a couple moments ago in terms of, that the difference between cognitive deconstruction and then understanding how that lives in your body. I think sometimes just knowing that can help to decrease shame, but I think then that also holds kind of a bit of a key as to like where this work needs to go in terms of like, this is in the body, like this is body based work. And the curiosity and compassion goes right in hand with that, because you're having to be curious about what is happening inside me. You're having to give yourself so much compassion of like, why am I feeling this way when I think this thing, right? But I think the thing that I try to, and maybe this is me being like in the most ideal way, but like we talked about this idea of this like dimmer switch versus the on off switch. And even early in our episode, we talked about the inner child, right? And this idea of reparenting. And so I think we can bring that into this too, to say, we may need to go back through and learn how to slowly turn that light switch on. And so it might be that we need to go back to learn like what is even non-sexual touch. What does that feel like? Can we experience that? Where do we find pleasure with touch that's non-sexual? Where do we find pleasure with touch that is sexual? Can we do that with ourselves? What happens in our bodies when we're turned on? What do we notice? How do we know if we're turned on? I mean, that was something I had to to
Mhm.
learn. Like I remember the first time I was able to be like, oh, I'm experiencing something. I didn't have that language of like being turned
Yeah.
on. Now I know that's what it was. But I was, like almost 30 years old. And I was like, what is this feeling? Right. And so
Yeah.
like if we ideally we would go slower so that our bodies can like warm up to that,
Yeah.
and for those people that have already like who have maybe like jumped into those sexual experiences and maybe experienced some flooding and overwhelm and whatever, it's okay. We can just kind of slow things back down and start at a pace and a place that feels comfortable to you. And I think that's
Yeah.
really important as well.
Yeah. And that's actually a perfect transition to my next question, regarding abstinence only teachings,
Ah,
which
yes.
how, yeah, I guess I would just like us to speak a little bit to that, like just how, within purity culture and then like the abstinence only approach, like just kind of speak to
Mm,
what is so problematic about that? What are the shortcomings of that?
yeah. I know when I was growing up in school, I did go to public school and I grew up, I'm thinking about like middle school, early high school. Well, even up to my like sophomore, junior year of high school. Yeah. Bill Clinton was the president.
Mm,
And I say that only because he signed into legislation. Abstinence only sex education was what was nationally funded. And so essentially, what that meant is that schools got additional funding for sex ed if they did abstinence only sex ed programs. I don't know if I'm proud of this, but I was I was like a peer teacher of that. It was called Enable Education Now and Babies Later, which was like,
education now and baby. Okay. Okay.
yeah.
I have not heard of this, but this is so interesting to me.
Yeah. So like we did sex ed for like as a high schooler, like I did
Yeah.
sex ed teaching or whatever for middle schoolers. And of course I had no idea what I was talking about. I should not have been teaching. But in terms of like the abstinence only, I think it's very limiting because of course it's teaching abstinence only. So there is no discussion of things like consent, things like safer
Right.
sex, things like contraception, um, understanding risks, understanding boundaries, things like that. So it's extremely reductive and ends up, like I was
Mhm.
talking about earlier, it ends up causing a lot of long-term impact because then 5, 10, 20 years afterwards, you still may not know how to do that and can end up being in really harmful relationships after that. Yeah, that's like my
Mhm.
little tip of the iceberg for abstinence only
Yeah.
education. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, everything you said, and it ties back into the analogy with the dimmer switch too. I think just, just
Yeah.
abstinence only, if that's all that is being taught.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. I think consent actually is the biggest piece
Oh my gosh.
that as I'm
Yes.
thinking about it, that's actually a big piece that I've seen both in terms of, like even, and then with clients I work with, like from both male and female, like people who've been raised as either in the church, in that environment. It's like consent on the one hand, realizing that I can say no.
Hmm.
Also knowing from, like, I'm thinking more from the perspective of those who were raised male in the church, like, um, how to make sure that you have consent, like don't, and
Hmm.
being respectful of that and being just aware and mindful of that, that even just the idea of even such a notion existing. Because, I mean, the thing is, it's like, even having grown up in that world too, like most men weren't wanting to inherently be predatory creeps. But at the
Yeah.
same time, it's like
Yeah.
the reality is, unfortunately, when there's just literally no notion of this thing called consent and bodily autonomy being a thing,
Hmm.
because we weren't raised in an environment or in a culture that actually promoted that. Your body was
Hmm.
not your own.
Hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
especially if you were raised female, but I mean, just in the Christian framework, in the Christian fundamentalist framework, you're not your
Hmm.
own. You were bought
No.
with a price, and so forth. So it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so. Anyway, all of that to say, I do think consent was a big one.
Hmm. There's research out there now that talks about how like making some sort of virginity or abstinence pledge really only delays the first sexual experience by about 6 months, though it does increase the shame a lot. And it increases your likelihood for unexpected like experiences such as STIs, unplanned
Yes.
pregnancies, and even abortions.
Mhm.
And there's also research that talks a lot about the correlation between a highly or even moderately religious folks, like adolescents, at an increased rate for terminating pregnancy through abortion, because of religion and family values and, not wanting to be seen a certain way. That's a whole other conversation. But it's so interesting that, so many people that preach this, like, no sex before marriage message and are extremely like this anti-abortion stance also are uninterested in teaching about safer sex and consent and how do we prevent unplanned pregnancies. And so there's that piece of it too. And the research is so extremely clear. And you can even go back to different presidential terms and see numbers of like abortions rise and fall or fall and rise depending on which political party is in office and their ability to kind of regulate sex education.
Mhm. Yeah, that I think that is what's so powerful, I think, to me, because even from an evidence-based perspective, it's like you said, the evidence is very clear and it's overwhelming
Mm-hmm.
if
Mm-hmm.
you take the time to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So as we're wrapping things up then, I think it would be kind of cool to give, like, if there's any resources that you have, and then I can share some too, but we can also talk about the upcoming weeks in our little purity culture series, which I'm excited about. Yeah. Are there any resources that you think of, just in terms of everything we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I do actually have one that's I've really been diving into lately that I've been appreciating, and I feel like this is, on the one hand, it feels very, very niche, but also I have had enough
Mm.
folks that I work with in this context that this is coming up. So, like polyamory and ethical consensual non-monogamy, like that's
Yeah.
actually a very common theme that comes up for a lot of folks, whether they ultimately want to do it or not, but they're curious about it and are wanting to know more. Um, there's actually a book called Polysecure: Attachment,
Yes, I've
Trauma, and
heard it's,
Consensual Non-Monogamy by
yeah,
Jessica Fern. And
love it.
yeah, that's actually, again, kind of niche. I mean, if you're not interested in ethical non-monogamy, fair enough. But I
Mhm.
know that a lot of folks are, and I also know that there's a lot of folks that are interested in it, but maybe don't even have the languaging to know how to ask or say or
Mhm.
advocate for themselves that
Mhm.
they are interested and want to know more. So
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
that's one I would recommend that.
Yeah. I have not read it, but I have only heard good things about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and especially that consent piece, which I think that
Mm-hmm.
so many of like the texts that talk about ethical non-monogamy, polyamory, things like that really focus so much on consent. And so
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not something, if ethical non-monogamy, maybe that's not something that interests you, the consent piece of it, I feel
Yeah.
like in some of these texts is done so well that it can
Yes.
really translate nicely into your life, regardless of kind of what your relational status is. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it brings in then like the attachment lens as well. And then the very, very trauma informed foundation too. So
Mhm.
I'm about halfway through, but I have nothing but good to say about it.
That's awesome. Yeah. I was thinking of a couple kind of practical resources. One is maybe a little bit less accessible in terms of like pricing and stuff. There is a curriculum called Our Whole Lives, or OWL, and I
Hmm.
believe, okay, I'm going to mess this up, it's either put out by the Universalist or the Unitarian Church, I cannot remember, but or Universalist Unitarian. So when, anyways, just Google our whole lives.
Our whole lives.
However, what I really like about it is that it is like a sex ed curriculum from birth to death. And so they really kind
Hmm.
of look at what is sexuality, sexual experiences, our sexual bodies uh, through our entire lives. And though I know it, like I said, it's the Universalist Church or whatever, the Universalist and Unitarian churches have a very different theology and view of people and issues and things like that. So we're not going to be getting that abstinence only education with that. The other resource that I would suggest is a website, and this is where it's a more accessible. It is called scarletine.com. And we can put these in the show notes. But it is a really comprehensive and inclusive resource. They actually, the person who is, I don't know, maybe started it. Their name is Heather Corinna. And there's a book on Amazon where you could just look up her name and would be able to find, it's kind of this like big textbook that's kind of like everything you need to know, like that you didn't know, but you do. And it's everything from talking about gender identity, sexuality, consent, all the different things. And I found it to be really, really nice because it just hits on so much of what we missed. And so because it's very inclusive, it's very trauma informed in nature. And so I just think it's really well done. And then this is kind of a little plug, and I realize this is mostly for individuals who were socialized female, but the American Girl company wrote a couple of books on puberty called The Care and Keeping of You. And then there's The Care and Keeping of You too. And I believe there is a version for boys as well. But they do a really, really good job of talking about like body changes and what to expect. And even though many people who are listening to this podcast are probably at the age where their bodies are not going through puberty anymore, it can be really nice to go back and read those books and just make sense of things. I remember when my therapist or a former therapist of mine actually suggested the book to me. And I remember when I was reading it, I was kind of imagining as if my like 13, 14-year-old self was sitting next to me. And I got to this part and just started bawling because there had been some experiences and like the lived experience of like my body, like what I was feeling in my body, that I had just felt so dirty and ashamed and disgusted just by my body changing. And I thought there was something wrong with me. And the way they described it, I was like, that was puberty. That was hormones. That's what was happening inside me. And I thought there was something wrong with me. And to have, 30 years later or 25 years later, here's this, like experience where I'm like, there wasn't anything wrong with me. My body was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. There was just some really nice things like that. And I learned a lot too. I was like, oh, I should do this, but I think that can be another really good resource. Just to have. So I will put out all of these resources in our show notes for today. Anything else on that you thought of, Andrew?
No, those all sound like really good resources. I'll need to check out some of those myself even. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So let's tell them a little bit about what's coming up.
Yes. So I am really excited about some of our upcoming guests and some of the upcoming episodes that we are going to be doing. This topic, the topic of just purity culture and everything that entails. I know it's a lot. And so I think it's really nice that we'll be able to kind of deep dive that even more and kind of have a mini series. I'm not going to give any spoilers as to who some of those guests are, but yes. I'm excited about it. And I'm sure some of these guests are folks that those of you listening are familiar with probably. And so, really excited, just really excited about that. I think it's, like I said earlier, I think these are much needed conversations and, it definitely deserves more than one episode.
Yes. Yeah. So yes, to that point, we have, I think, 5 more episodes planned on purity culture. But the nice part about it is we, like Andrew said, we're talking to a myriad of people. We have people who are professionals, working with clients. We have people who have lived experiences and really are trying to focus on, the experience of being, growing up in a body, being socialized male in purity culture and female in purity culture, and talking about various aspects of, just the impacts of it, what it's like to not fit in those gender stereotypes and all the things, everything that goes along with purity culture. I know these are really important episodes because, like we said at the beginning, all of our clients are coming in with stuff related to purity culture. So it felt really important that we take several episodes to talk about this, and in the future we'll talk about it more, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's kind of a great place to close things out for today. And yeah,
Yeah.
anything else?
I don't think so. I just looking forward to our upcoming episodes, and it's been a great
Hmm.
conversation today. And yeah, I appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody. See you next time.
See you next time.